Okay, morning everybody. Let's go ahead and start. We have Benito Arruñada here today. He's visiting the workshop for most of November, and he knows he's got 5 minutes less, my 10 seconds. So.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here this work. Let me say something about the motivation to this work, which in essence has to do with the fact that I distrust even more, the masses than the elites. And given this relative distrust, when I was invited to present a paper in a conference at Duke 2 weeks ago, a conference organized by the World Justice Project, that is the organization building one of these international indices, the Rule of Law Index, classifying, ranking countries according to the rule of law. Well, I came back to an old issue, which has to do with this masses versus elite conflict, but in particular it has to do with the fact that this organization, the World Justice Project, follows what has become weird, in my opinion, weird emphasis on universality and on developing institutions with an universal emphasis. I mean, developing institutions for everybody, for the masses, in a way, which is definitely not the way our institutions, our current institutions, were developed in the transition between the ancient regime and the modern regime, I mean, in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. Going more narrowly, what I have been seeing in the last few years, in the last years, 20 years, not a few, that I have been involved in property titling, land reforms, and so on, was that the application of these universal principles in land titling, I mean, granting titles to everybody, to say it briefly, is a disaster. It's a waste of money, and it means the creation of huge bureaucracies that serve only the purposes of the World Bank. This resonates with two theoretical strands. One is the Hayekian emphasis on the fact that information is distributed in very particular manners in society. Information is concentrated, and also information is specific, in the terms of Jensen and Meckling, is hard to transfer, costly to transfer. Also, it resonates with the argument, quite unpopular argument, first by Weingast and then by North Weingast Wallitz, that when developing institutions, we should first think about the elites, developing institutions for the elites, for instance, independent judiciaries, for the elites, not necessarily for the masses. This is also related to the land titling issues. And in fact, as an introduction, I provide an adaptation of a paper I did with Nuno Garopa just ago about land titling that makes this argument on the basis of simply the existence of fixed costs. If you have fixed costs for developing an institution, and if you have also fixed costs for using the institution, it is the elites who are going to use the institutions, and the designers of the institutions, but this institution should focus on the elites, not on the masses. Okay, this is related also to some other works of mine, which have in principle nothing to do, and I provided this just to give you a big picture, that this issue might be in many different areas. In particular, it's clearly the issue of the judiciary. What we find in this experimental paper with Casari, for instance, is that when the masses are given rights, I mean, when the judge is independent to decide, but his decisions are linked to the opinion of the masses, in particular in this example, the debtors, the market disappears because there is a tendency not to enforce the contracts. And the market is very fragile. We had made this argument before and analyzed its historical roots and how the institutions of the liberal state solve this problem by, in a sense, making the judges very dependent. In continental Europe, in the common law, the solutions were different. But a very similar problem with, I don't have time to go into the details, has to do with the development of the moral code in Christianity, for which you have very two different solutions with centralization and experts, the Catholic solution, but you have also reliance on the masses in the Protestant solutions, with very weird, very particular consequences in short terms and in the long term, and different consequences for the health of the churches than for the health of society. You can make an argument that the Protestant design might have been good for societies, but probably it was less good for the churches themselves. This is about the motivation. Do I have a minute?
No, you have -1 minute.
Minus 1 minute already. Well, the exercise, the empirical exercise, just to provide the framework. The empirical exercise is very simple, has to do with survey data. And what I did was to develop experience indicators. My concept of elite is, in a sense, the experienced individuals. Develop also performance indexes of the rule of law. And, in essence, consider experience as a treatment. This is made for 4 areas of law: contract, criminal, administrative, and labor. And for each of them, I built binary experience variables and indices of performance, which are, most of them, 3 of them are principal components. And then, well, together with the usual suspects of covariates and country controls, run different, most of them descriptive regressions, but perhaps related to the demand of services, perception of performance, and difference in performance, which is the one with most practical consequence in terms of the consequence for the rankings and for the World Justice Project. In principle, for academic purposes, the most interesting one might be this one, because it's the one that I hope could support some causal inference. The results are of this type. The results are that experience, having this contractual or criminal experience, means that we observe that perceptions of performance are substantially affected in a negative sense in the 4 areas. Here you have only the results for contracts. And this effect seems to be quantitatively greater, because the numbers are relatively comparable, much greater than the usual suspects that in these cross-country studies are often taken as the important variables. And this happens for the 4 areas.
So now you're at -4 minutes.
Well, okay, let's stop here. Well, I don't have time for consequences. Do I have time for consequences?
So let's take some questions.
Yeah, okay, let's go.
So Michael.
Yeah, first of all, so thanks, it's a very sort of nice idea to look into this. I have a couple of questions. All right, first, I was puzzled, why do you get the education having a highly statistically significant and positive coefficient on experience with crime? I would have expected exactly the opposite. But more important question is, do you have any explanation for the results? Because I would have understood if you could argue that in some countries it goes one way, in other countries it goes another way. But to say that in all countries, people who never experienced conflicts or crime and all that sort of consistently overestimate the performance of these institutions, it sort of baffles me. So it begs for the explanation, and I didn't see it in your paper.
Yeah, going to this point, I mean, for countries we would have to go. I did some analysis, but didn't have time to go into the very details of having interactions for each country, with each country, that means, no? I didn't have time to go into the detail. What I have done is to instead of using country controls, take GDP, no? And you find this. But I don't have a, I mean, this is what the data is telling us, no? This result is a bit puzzling, you know, that experience, what is the last row? Experience, I mean, wealthier populations, in wealthier countries, the impact of experience.
It's even worse, basically.
Sorry? It's bigger.
Yeah, it seems to be.
It's bigger. Therefore, experience means the difference between people having this experience and people not having this experience. The analysis is heavily constrained by the data available. And we could go into the details. What do you mean by experience? Go into these questions. No? My biggest surprise was to find negative coefficients, not for all, because there is an exception, as you might have seen, with litigation, but litigation there are a few observations, and litigation is a different concept of experience. No? One of my normative suggestions to the people developing the index was, you should probably try to include more experience variables, and also to measure different types of experience is possible, to refine the concept of experience. No? Because it seems that there might be something there.
My problem is that there might be selection there, and
well, selection.
It's hard
I mean,
to.
this is observational data, and it's always a problem, no? The only solution, as I have applied, is do a matching exercise. No, the matching, well, is here with not only with the main experience variables, but I have secondary experience variables, which is litigation, being only a victim of crime, being only a criminal. This is not a puzzle. Criminals and victims seem to have the same perception. The chain in perception after being a criminal or being a victim is similar, which is a serious puzzle. I didn't expect that. No, that it seems that to be in touch is what defines the experience. No? The matching, the results are quite good, and I did the matching the best I could. I mean, these numbers in particular have matching at the country level. Therefore, is the only weakness, if I may say, is labor. But the labor, as you saw, the labor indicator of performance is quite poor, because it's not a principal component. It's only one question about unions. You don't know even if it is not sensible. My advice was, if you want to go and say something about labor, you need more questions here in the surveys.
We have a empty queue, which is so Lee.
Yeah, this is sort of following up Michael's point. I mean, it's so your introduction, I'm not sure if exactly matches with the econometrics. I mean, I know the whole North Wallace wine gas story. You want to tie the hands of elites, or elites want to tie their own hands so as to get all the benefits associated with economic growth. And that's kind of their story. And that's the Wallace is continuing with that. But here, with the judiciary, I mean, one can interpret this. You'd think people with experience know more than those without experience. Okay, so they're rating these institutions as poor, but it still begs the question why. I mean, it's not clear they know more. I mean, they have experience, but it could be that. I mean, one could take it another way and saying, well, they don't like the courts because. If the courts are really impersonal, they don't like it because they want to be above that. They want to be treated differently, and so it's sort of this, again, puzzle that I'm not sure exactly how to interpret it. I'm not sure if it's I mean, there's the perception and there's the reality. So we have no way of judging the reality except on the perceptions. And we have two sets. People who've experienced it and they say, wow, this is terrible. And those who don't, it's relative to them. So they think things are better. But it's again, I'm trying to get a real good interpretation of it.
I agree.
And also then how it really fits with the emergence, with your normative story of, I mean, I know your work on titling, and I agree with you certainly about titling. It seems like a lot of wasted resources a lot of times. But then how much you want to follow through on courts and their universality, because again, if we take the North Wallace-Weingas world, to get to the open access world, you really want an impersonal world where no one's above the law. And so I'm just finding this a little puzzling. Maybe more interactions, but there was a lot of results to wade through. So anyways, just your take on the interpretation.
Well,
I guess.
the first idea is very simple. You are emphasizing course. The indexes are much more diverse.
Right, that's true.
In fact, this,
Good point.
this makes the issue more puzzling because is here. No? We have similar results for criminal, for administrative law, and then but I emphasize contracts because I studied that more carefully. In principle, my intention was to study only contracts, only the judiciary and so on. This, you have a point or several points there, but at the same time, one of my advices to the World Justice Project was to ask about recurrent experience and to see if people with, for instance, one contractual conflict what about having many contractual conflicts? One of the variables that turns out to be more consistently significant with the same sign and so on is another, I am not treating it as an experience variable, but maybe I should, which is being economically active. Being economically active means also an experience, and I don't know if some of these particular experience variables are measuring this type of, at least in the contractual area, measuring this type of variable. Being economically active doesn't suffer this problem you mentioned of, well, they are reacting negatively to the experience of being in contact with institutions. But even if this is the case, this reacting negatively contains some information that could be interpreted as an evaluation of the institution. Keep in mind, for instance, if you have had a conflict, a contractual conflict, I would assume that 50% of the cases were decided in favor, 50%, there is no reason to. It seems, therefore, that the response might be driven, but we would need, ideally, to make more questions in this direction. The response might be driven more by factors like how much time have you spent in the process, etc., etc. Not only by the judicial decision itself. No? And with the other cases, more or less the same. Asking for a permit or being in touch with the police, which is not the course. For the criminal cases, it's 8 indicators, but most of them are related to the police. No? The question about the link with the theory, obviously, there is a big, and I should have mentioned that, no, there is a big space between the motivation and the very narrow exercise. No? Let me say only that, there is a huge conflict now in Western societies, a huge divide about the role of experts, the role of elites, and the role of experts. No? And much of solving our problems depends on finding the right way of defining the elite, defining the people with knowledge, if we go Hayekian. No? And this exercise, in a sense, try to explore who are the elites. The elites ideally should be the ones with information. From these numbers, I am inclined to move myself in the direction that the elites are not the people with PhDs. as we tend to assume in academia. The elites are the people with real experience of economic activity. Which in a sense, in many cases might be closest to the masses, but not to the whole population. Some members of the masses, which probably have not much education. And coming back to your issue, no? the education and experience are here the main, in a sense, the main fighting variables, no?
Well,
To think about them.
so you never addressed my first question.
Yeah.
Why do you have the result that people with more education are more exposed to crime? I have no idea why that would be the case.
Well,
See, so it's great to have regressions and have significant coefficients, but it would be nice to have interpretations, right? Meaningful
well,
interpretations.
these are perceptions. This is not. You mean
The education.
what I'm calling the demand?
No. So in your experience table, it's like the first or second table or something. Right? Education has a positive coefficient.
Yeah, you were just there.
So
Let me find it.
yeah, it's like the first table or something.
Yeah, but it's not the first table in the slide.
Okay, well, all right, I'll try.
And I think I don't have it here.
Let's let that simmer and go on to minute.
Yes,
We can come back to that.
yes.
Are you talking about this one?
Go ahead.
Okay,
No, it's table number 2.
Oh, they were.
they're still busy.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Kevin, please, yes.
All right, well, I also don't quite see any relevance of the theoretical discussion in the beginning to the empirical part. And I have some comments on that matter, but those be better addressed privately. More to the point, I think I might have an explanation of why experience with justice system could adversely affect the performance of the system. And it goes as follows. People have some priors about how the justice system works.
Yeah.
And then if they are exposed to the system, then it's a reason for them to readjust the priors based on their personal experience. Now, a well-functioning rule of law system is a system where people actually don't go to courts because litigation is costly, and even if a matter is settled in your favor, you still pay your fees and litigation costs.
The data I have presented is not going to court. It's having a contractual conflict.
Okay.
There is another variable, which is litigation, that poses the opposite. In principle, it shows the opposite sign. Then, when doing the matching, it
Well,
is
I
not
think
significant.
I would suspect that there is a correlation between having a contractual conflict and going to court. So these are correlated variables at the very least. And also being a victim of a crime is the same thing. What I was going to say, especially if you apply the American rule, even if you win the case, then you still bear the legal costs and so on and so forth. So the experience with the court system leaves you oftentimes, if not most of the time, a little bit worse off than you would have been otherwise. And perhaps this law system...
If people are rational, it shouldn't be.
Yeah,
Well, rational...
And if the decision to go into court is voluntary, which is not always voluntary, because at the very minimum it depends on the other party.
Yes.
No, it's-
Again, as I said, if there is a court case, it's somewhat a failure of the rule of law system. And in that case, it wouldn't be surprising because it did not deliver a settlement that people would obtain out of court. And if courts are transparent and fair and whatnot, then courts will be in fact redundant in actual life. And if not, of course there are cases when courts are inevitable, contracts are incomplete. and
In this
stuff.
sample, people litigated, I don't remember the names exactly, but there are, I think, 11,000, more or less 100,000 observations, and 11,000 have a contractual conflict in the last 3 years. And from this, sort of 3,000 or 4,000 have litigated.
And also, finally, baseline in that case is unclear. You go to court, the case is settled, perhaps even settled in your favor, but not until you have spent some resources, so on and so forth. And if you are of higher opinion of the court than before, or lower opinion, that probably depends on some baseline, which you do not have. And in that case...
These complications apply mainly to the contractual index, to the contract law index. I mean, the other indexes have, I would say, structurally similar problems, which are very different. And the concept of experience and also the indices of performance are different. It might be by chance that the coefficients turn out to be significantly negative and so on, but they could suggest some information linked to experience, which, as Lee said, is very difficult to interpret if there is knowledge really behind this experience. But there are serious hints that there might be knowledge.
Very finally, if I may, my very last comment would be that there is a well-known difference between corruption measures, corruption perception, corruption experience. And I think this gap might be something that would be similar to what you observed in which case.
I have something on corruption because, and it turns out to be similar in the way. Sorry. Because for administrative law, I have two experience variables, which are asking for a permit, and the second experience variable is if you have asked for an administrative permit, have you been asked for a bribe? Which is corruption related. The two experiences turn out to present quite similar results. Let me show you. Well, here in the slides I have only this is the match sample. Well, in a sense, the most reliable, no? And the coefficients are different, but they are negative. I mean, the samples are very different because, I mean, here you have only 5,000 observations because only a few people have been asked a bribe, no? And here there are 40,000. There are much less than in the whole sample because the matching, as you know, the matching excludes, to make the samples comparable, the procedure excludes many observations to make the two samples as similar as possible. I mean, to sort of reproduce an experimental design.
Claudia.
And thank you for the talk. And I wonder whether you divided the sample by, I know that you have an interaction with the GDP, but I wonder whether you divided the sample by poor and rich countries. I would expect that probably the answers will be different. And also by institutional design, federal versus unitary countries, or even parliamentarian and presidential systems, or even two house in Congress and only one house in Congress. I would expect that all these things matter a lot for the way that the people respond.
I did try. I did try. There was no much difference, and it was a matter of presentation. I mean, comparing GDP. The basic regressions are with country dummies. The alternative is to use GDP, and GDP especially make easier the presentation and the interaction. I mean, building the interaction. I try also the 4 types of countries, which are defined by the sample themselves. I mean, 4 types. I mean, 4 quartiles of countries. It didn't change much. I mean, there was some nonlinearity. If I remember, some equations, but it was not systematic. There was no systematic pattern there. No. I try also because the sample is rich in having. I mean, the sample is made in the 3 main cities. In the 3 main cities of each country, and there are city variables. I try to use city dummies instead of countries. Doesn't change. I mean, the results are robust to this.
Did you find any outliers?
There was outliers, and it's mentioned in the paper. I don't know if I included in the annex. Excluding the outliers doesn't change anything. That it's mentioned there. The outliers, I guess, are driven by what? Are driven by Jordan, for instance, is an outlier. Are driven by the poor performance of the surveying company, in a way, or the difficulties to survey specific countries, with respect to some questions and so on. It's a bit tricky, and probably more work needs to be done in terms of improving the quality of cleansing the data in terms of avoiding some of these issues. But I doubt that this cleansing may affect the results, because up to now, the cases I found, it didn't. Jordan was a case that I had. It was problematic. Talking with the people at the World Justice Project, they just confirmed that Jordan was a sort of problem. Also, the surveys are made with different means. In developed countries, they do it online. In developing countries, they do it with interviews. In some other countries, they use telephone. I tried to check, especially in the country differences, if there were, if this was significant. Unfortunately, it interferes with the countries, because the decision to choose one method or another is driven by the degree of development of the country. No? I didn't find anything systematic, but this is remains an open question. No? If the outliers, for instance, I suspected that were driven by this, no? But I didn't confirm this position.
I'm going to jump in, but the queue is then open, so I don't know your name, I'm sorry? Sam, I'll go. So there's a lot of questions here. I like Lee, the link between sort of the title and the way you start this and then to this stuff, which you're estimating how people perceive rules and some narrow things, seems not tight, I'll say.
No,
and
okay.
so I think you should tighten that. And I was just
Or change the title.
or yeah, something. There's a lot of potential ways to go. And I also think that early on the notion of elites versus masses is funny. Elites are just people who seem to have a lot of interaction with.
Right.
So if you're I'm redoing a house. So if you're a contractor, in your world you're an elite because you're dealing with the permitting board, but you're not an elite in any meaningful way. So I think you need to clarify what that is, and then thinking about what this has to do with the rule of law. It seems to be approximately nothing. I mean, when I think of the rule of law, I think of stable rules. Now I'm looking at the World Justice Project's definition of the rule of law, which is, I thought, it's kind of stunning. It says effective rule of law reduces corruption, all the bad things, it combats poverty and so forth. It doesn't suggest a stable rule that you can plan on. That's what you could have different rules of law that have a nice index in terms of what you want, but they might be very different for different countries. But here it's just a ranking of the things people in Western Europe like, basically, as far as I can tell.
No,
But your stuff doesn't get at that.
No,
It's not either.
well, accepted.
Well,
But
so what does it tell us? What does this tell us about the rule?
about the leads. First, about the leads. And I let the slides at the beginning. I am conscious that this is not that this has to be modified in terms of eventually publishing the paper and so on. No, the focusing, saying what the paper does instead of what the author would like to be doing. But there is something into I think, to brainstorm about this idea of finding informational elites. Redefining the elite. Oh, let's call it X instead of elite. But allocating decision rights, because the process, I should mention this. This is a decision-making process. I mean, the indexes, these indices, as the doing business index and so on, are informational devices that some decision makers use to make decisions. For instance, in this case, allocation of aid money for funding projects. They look at the position of these countries and they allocate money. It's an information device. Therefore, well, this is from my managerial background. It is important how you design these informational devices because it's going to influence the decisions. And therefore, which kind of people you ask and so on. No? And which kind of questions is important. No, then, these informational elites, that less, in a way, there is a sort of normative element that starts thinking about which people have information and then try to allocate decision-making power to these people. In this case, well, you implicitly allocate decision power to the people if you pay more attention to what people with experience say. If I am right in guessing that the people with experience have better information, which, I mean, is in doubt.
Sam?
So just a couple points about the methods and then just something about the conclusions. It seemed a bit that the administrative indicator, people who had sought permits, seems to select already for folks who would be in a position to need to ask for permits or know the process of doing so. So it seems that the knowledge, there's educational factors perhaps baked in. The same with the types of crimes listed for the criminal to be extorted or victim of an armed robbery to have sort of a secure place that somebody would want to rob. Seems that it would maybe answer for the education question. My interest is in designing institutions, so the the conclusion you seem to be suggesting about modeling institutions for elites as a corrective mechanism for like their performance or in places where there's less capacity. It seems like there might be some circular issues with the notion that the people who are experienced at having specific information will be the ones who are assessed in designing the institution. It just seems to have an issue in two different ways. The first being that those with experience, especially like repeat players, are already ones who have access to the institutions and are likely to be consulted in the process of designing institutions. But then also just the sort of transaction costs involved in reforming institutions and the populations they serve, their internal procedures, how they would do outreach, notify people. That seems that would be an issue later down the road if you initially adapted institutions just to serving the people that first needed them. And I was just curious about your response. Sorry, I just wanted to point out that the WJP definition about the rules-based system in which the process by which the laws are enacted, that part, not just the administered or enforced, but the enacted, that's sort of where my interest in this question of design comes from.
The way how they are enacted.
In footnote 1, you describe the definition of WJP, and it refers to the rule of laws involving the process of enactment too. So this sort of who's consulted, who's at the table when institutions are designed. It's just, that's where it's stemming from, my interest in this design question. Just for more background.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm wondering, you might be right that there is some circularity. In general terms, no, if independently of how we measure, no, but even if there is this circularity, it might be the case that it is the elites who have the information and who are in closer to the north point. No, I was just when you started posing this issue. I mean, even if you are right, what is the consequence? We need to use the information available. No, that's the deeper point. Therefore, the key question turns out to be, do they have really better information? I suspect. And that's, in terms of ideally redesigning the empirical exercise and redesigning the surveys, asking different questions, because some of these problems could be solved with the right questions, no? Distinguishing different types of experience. Even with the different types of experience available, there are aspects that can be, for instance, about crime that you mentioned too. Well, your point is clearer for victims, but here in the index we have both. And let me tell you, I try to disentangle them in different ways, because there are victims who are also criminals. Therefore, I'm getting this result because it's overlap. Well, let's try to identify, to do only the experience of being a criminal without being a victim, and being a victim without being a criminal. Nothing changed in essence. It's another surprising result, which is purely observational. I mean, I don't have even a theory of what. By the way, the question that about education, something interesting happens. It's true that education has a positive coefficient with criminal law in terms of having crime experience, which is being a criminal or being a victim. Well, being a criminal means having been detained or having been abused, or having been a victim. That's a positive. Also, being a victim, purely a victim, is also positive, but having been detained or abused, education has, the correlation is not significant. Therefore, educated people are not detained more often or abused more often.
But they are criminals more often and victims.
They are victims more often. They are victims more often. They are not criminals more often.
Well,
they are victims. In a sense, they are only victims more often. They are not criminals more often. Because crime experience is a mix. Crime experience is a mix.
So crime experience is both.
It's
and
both.
being a victim
It's both.
is one.
It's
I
both.
see.
Yeah. It's both.
Okay. All right.
It's both. Therefore, it makes some sense. I mean, more educated people. I mean, these are.
It's still a little bit strange.
What is more strange even is that wealth doesn't mean being more a victim. That you would expect that with greater wealth you would be, with greater wealth you are also more able to self-protect.
Yeah, I mean,
being male is clearly both positively correlated to being a criminal and a victim. That's that's a clear, I mean, as expected. And age also is negative. The most interesting result here, for me, is the economic active variable. Economic active variable, I mean, those economically active have more experience in all dimensions.
Yeah, of course. No, if you're sitting at home, like, all the time, you don't have experience.
Well, this has consequences for
Okay, let's go on to Cyan.
I think.
No, Cyan first.
Oh,
please.
sorry.
Yeah.
Well, first, I absolutely share your desire to design appropriate indicators for the policy relevance of them, right? And I've seen this happen again and again when a measurement for rule of law or political violence or state repression or something like that is used for things like development grants without a deeper understanding of how that indicator is actually constructed. But I took your discussion about land rights as the motivation for your paper. You seem to think, in your presentation, you talked a little about the focus on elites, right? And so changing this focus. And I wondered what the implications of the results from your rule of law project has in a similar vein. So how would we design a judiciary that focuses on the types of elites that you find to be most important from these indicators? So if we're not talking about our traditional notion of elites, but you're suggesting an alternative conception of what an elite would be, I'm not sure from a policy perspective how that plays out here. So what type of judicial institutions are you thinking kind of first off the bat?
Well, this paper has very little to say on the design of judiciaries themselves. The paper has aims to have something to say on the design of indicators about judiciary performance. If these indicators work better, they will better inform the design of these institutions. In a sense, it's Hayekian. Let's try to know where the information is and grant these people some decision rights to modify the institutions. Which is, I think, this perspective really could add something, because this is not the perspective going on, especially in development circles. I mean, the perspective is that experts in development know, and they impose even without realizing that they are imposing their own world view, no, their own. Yeah, that should be, even in the paper, this might be contradictory with some aspects of the paper as it is stand now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Reading the paper, it appears that there is an underlying assumption that the knowledge, there is a difference between the knowledge of an average citizen in terms of the efficiency of courts and the actual reality of cost, the efficiency of courts and the actual performance of courts, such that the average citizen thinks that the courts are more efficient than they actually are. And the citizens acquire the true knowledge about the courts after they have this experience with it. But I just couldn't locate the evidence of this mechanism. This perception could be due to the costs that individuals incur in litigating with the system, because, as you define in page 4, going to court involves a certain amount of costs. And, your results might very well be due to the costs that these individuals incurred, rather than the fact that they reached the accurate level of perception. And coming from a developing country myself, yes, there is this mismatch in populist rhetoric of leaders and reality, but I'm not sure if that's a global phenomenon as well.
No.
Yeah.
But let's assume that it's true, that the numbers are driven, the negative coefficient of experience is driven by the fact that those with experience realize that there is costly to use the institutions. Before they thought there was no cost. Well, in that case, they would be better informed, because the cost is part of efficiency. Efficiency is value minus cost. Therefore, it's okay. They are better informed. They would be better informed. The institutions are not free.
Yes, they would be better informed, but the way you describe
I could build an argument that when they are voting, and tomorrow we have elections, no? When they are voting, those without experience are voting assuming that there is no cost in, I don't know, providing health care. Therefore, if experience informs about cost, welcome. In fact, I am exploring now a survey by the ISSP to try to apply the same framework to what? Tax decisions. I mean, the information about tax decisions and what people say. But trying to explore closer to your point, no, in terms of general cost of public services and so on.
We have an open queue. Please back on. Oh, Gustavo. I'll let Gustavo go first.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Just a quick comment. So there is a literature on lobby, an interest group that essentially uses this information idea. So essentially those that are lobbying are transmitting information to the politicians. So I think it's highly connected with what we are doing here. So maybe I think it's interesting to connect with that literature. Okay. And there I think if you want to connect with the discussions in that literature, it's like you can see a lobby as pure influence thing. I am buying policies, or I'm informing the decision makers. No, so this push you more in a positive view of lobby, while the other one puts you more in a negative perspective on lobby. And then a second kind of connected point. It's I think maybe it could be interesting to see the whole idea more or less with that framework, no? So essentially the key thing is, I think there are two interesting questions going on. One is those that are more informed, they also have an incentive to invest in these institutions or not, and then what biases they could have. So essentially, are we sure that it will always dominate that are more informed? I guess that if you are extremely biased, it could be that that we want to give more decision powers even to less informed people to balance that bias. No? There must be some trade-off there.
Yeah, there might be.
There
There must be, okay. I agree in principle, however, think about the respondents here. The respondents are why they are not interviewing lobbyists here. They are normal people, and they are asked, have you had contractual conflict in the last 3 years? Or have you, yes, of course, there is a little bit of, they are more prominent in economic activity, more economically active, blah, 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 all the table, the first table, table 2, and so on. But they are far away from the, in a sense, they are far away from the characters, the players in this literature about lobbying. No? Therefore, it's something to explore clearly, and it would, if you have more suggestions on which literatures to interact with, it would be very useful, because, I mean, this is a sort of exercise out of the blue, in a sense. We're going from the what is in, there is some literature about experts similar to this one, some discussion in the literature on indicators, on cross-national indicators and so on, because, for instance, the governance indicators of the World Bank have been built with the opinion of experts, and some people in political science have heavily criticized that by interviewing experts, they are, I myself criticize the Doing Business project because they have been interviewing lawyers, and lawyers have particular interest in with respect to some institutions, for instance, registries and so on. They compete with them, and therefore their opinions are not independent. No? Well, let me stop here. No? Very interesting.
Yeah, Lee?
Yeah, I think the discussion has helped me see, I think, what you're getting at. In a way, you could think of the people without any experience live in a zero transaction cost world, because they never engage in these services. So they have a high school or grade school civics view of how society works. Bureaucracies are great, courts are great, government's great, everything's great. And then anytime you go to experience it, you go, oh no, Department of Motor Vehicles, terrible. Getting a permit for anything, terrible. Getting, because it's always a hassle, right? You have to have time and money. And so I think it's just sort of saying there's not a free lunch out there, and the average citizen thinks there's a free lunch, or that transaction costs are zero. That you don't have to wait in line, you don't have to pay bribes, you don't have to do these things, when in fact you do in the real world. So anyone with experiences are going to say, no, we really know how the sausage is made, and it's pretty nasty. So, and I think that's your point. And so if you want to reform it, then the question is, the next step would be, I agree, people with experience know best perhaps how to reform it, but what's the cost? So you'd really want to know, should we reform one of these indicators? How do you get the most bang for your buck? If I were asking your advice, how would you say we should use this to go with the experience, but then what's the cost?
The cost especially of relying more on people with experience, the cost in terms of which biases would this, for instance, which biases would, well, here we could think from the extreme, saying that, well, this would be a kind of captured government, captured institutions, to the other extreme, that thinking, well, these people have pure information and not, is this in a sense the same question? Maybe much has to do with my previous answer, which type of respondents are there, not what is the. For instance, are these respondents? Practically, one of my emphasis 2 weeks ago was to beg these people to refine their questions about experience in terms of recurring experience, accumulation of experience, different types of.
Okay, there are 3 people on the queue. I'm just going to let you. I'm going to ask you to not respond until you get all of them because we're running out of time. So go Angie, since she has gone, Leonid, and Sam. So go ahead.
I just have a quick one to think through a little bit. To me, criminal, administrative, and labor law are all public and contract is private. And I would flesh that out. That contract conflict could be that I'm actually more elite, that I don't end up in conflict. And the rest are the state coming to bear upon me, and I don't always have that opportunity. I just fleshed that out a bit.
Leonid?
To follow on what Lee said, and also myself, that's why experience is frustrating. There is another paper by someone by name Denison. It's about the attitude of migrants to institutions and environment in countries where they come to, mostly Europe. And these people come from developing countries or from transition countries. And one strange phenomenon is that over time, they become more skeptical about the society and the institutions because they arrive with very rousing expectations.
We know which respondents are.
And this is what, well, just to say that actual experience could be sobering. And as Denison puts it, people are in a honeymoon period early on. They have very high expectations about these new countries.
No, but what I mean is that we know which respondents are immigrants.
Let's take the last question, and then you can wrap it all up.
So
Sam, go ahead.
On that point, it seems that the people who were detained is potentially the only part of the population that's entering this legal relationship or conflict involuntarily, and I think it'd be more useful if we had a broader subset of folks who are being pulled into the system without knowledge of it or without intention. And then just to come back to the earlier point with perhaps an example, I think if we were to study voting in the US and ask people who voted, how would you reform the system? They might say more polling workers, more ballot boxes, more information in advance, but what we would not capture is what's keeping 62% of the people from voting. The access issues based on how the institution's originally structured, standing in a judiciary or representation. So I think that the value of what information people possess is not restricted solely to those who have accessed the institution, but also those who haven't for some reason.
We have a couple minutes.
Well, I must think very carefully about this, especially considering that I have been for a long time proposing this very same point in my critique to doing business. The doing business indicators ask the concept of user they have, and in particular in the context of land and company registries. The concept of user is the person filing papers and if you understand what is the function of this institution, a land register or a property or a company's registry, the important user is the court because the register produces evidence for the court. Therefore, the relevant user that you should be asking their opinion about are judges, no users. And asking users poses precisely this type of question. That is true. However, with respect to what? I could say that it's better to ask judges than those filing papers. But it might be better to ask those filing papers close to my definition of experience than the general population who has no idea about what is going on. Therefore, it's a relative matter. But you are right.
It's straight up 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very useful comments. Thank you.
My mom was, yeah, she came and she said,